Okay, so welcome to this Around the World in Virtual Clinical Trials session for Genesis 2020. I think being forced online this year has really forced us to think outside the box, or at least outside the screens that we're looking at. I think, how do we collaborate around the world, but how do we learn from each other? And for me, it's been a great opportunity to work with a number of collaborators to get the perspective around the same topic, but from very different locations and dynamics and a toolbox to work with. So I'm delighted we have our esteemed panel this evening. But before we move to the panel, I'd just like to introduce the collaborators we work a lot with to help that international deal making and trade and awareness. So I'll come to Kathleen Henry first to allow you to say a few words, Kathleen.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks so much, Tony. And just thanks again for inviting us to be a part of another program of yours. We were thrilled to help organize a webinar discussion back during the summer for your On Helix conference, and are just super pleased to continue this conversation today for Genesis 2020. As brief introduction, my name is Kathleen Henry. I work for Wake County Economic Development. I lead our international business initiatives and manage our business recruitment and expansion activities. Our organization is the primary agency that is supporting smart economic growth for Wake County. That county is the largest within the Research Triangle region and home to North Carolina's capital city, Raleigh. So for those of you who are listening who aren't familiar with our region, I'll just give you the highest level overview. So the Triangle gets its name from our 3 Tier 1 research universities, Duke, North Carolina State University, and the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Right in the middle of all 3 of these universities is the Research Triangle Park. That's a 7,000-acre research park and the largest in the United States. We're also home to more than 560 life science companies, accounting for over 31,000 jobs. So our region consistently ranks as one of the leading life science clusters in the United States. And I think the conversation that's about to happen will definitely shed some light on, why we have that accolade here in the Triangle. So Tony, thanks again for the invitation. I definitely look forward to continuing this partnership, and I'm happy to discuss the Research Triangle in more detail with any members that are interested. So thank you.
Thank you, Kathleen. And our friend from down under, Sandra Lauer.
Hello, everyone. Welcome from Adelaide, South Australia. I'm very happy to participate in this discussion today. So I'm from the South Australian Government, from the Department for Trade and Investment, and we support South Australian companies in their trade efforts, and we also support companies from overseas trying to come to South Australia. We are also running a workshop as part of Genesis, so feel free to hook into that, where we'll be talking more about clinical trials in Australia. I wanted to mention a few things that are special in Australia about clinical trials. So for those of you that don't know it, often you can look it up under the Australian Advantage. So we offer very fast clinical trials, specifically in the first-in-human area, with very high quality, so to FDA, EMA, and other regulatory agency standards, to a costly price. So we have fairly low price because we have several investment initiatives, for example, the R&D tax incentive. So please reach out to me. And one last comment, I've talked to Tony a few times over the last few months, and only recently we actually went into further restrictions. We've actually been hardly affected by the COVID-19 pandemic, maybe due to we are a bit more isolated here. We've got about 1.2 million people living in South Australia and had so far under 500 cases, and we are well tracked with contact tracing and so on. So really it's been business as usual mostly, but at the same time we have seen an acceleration of all electronic processes, specifically in the conduct of clinical trials, where we will be talking about it today. Thank you, Tony.
Thank you, Sandra. So just going back to myself, I'm Tony Jones, and I head up a non-profit life science membership organization called One Nucleus. who we're there really well. Headquarters are in Cambridge, UK, and part of our remit working with our members is to reach out around the world, look for opportunities that our members may want to engage in, but also learn from. And I'm delighted to have such coverage here for this session this afternoon. So without any more from me, I'm going to hand over to Dianne Lee, one of our long-standing One Nucleus members and an expert in the clinical development side, who's going to run us through a discussion around virtual clinical trials. Dianne, over to you.
Thank you very much, Tony. So yes, as Tony said, I'm Dianne Lee. I'm the Managing Director at DLRC, which is a specialist regulatory affairs consultancy. We're based in the UK, and we've also got somewhere in Germany. So I'd like to sort of go through the panel, and maybe you can introduce yourselves to everybody and then give your view of the current landscape and the trends in this virtual clinical trial space. So perhaps if we go to Yvonne, if we go to you first.
Yes. Hi everybody, my name is Yvonne Lungershausen and I'm the CEO of Avance Clinical. Avance Clinical is a full service CRO headquartered here in Adelaide, South Australia. And we predominantly conduct trials in the early phase space, and that's in phase 1 through to phase 2. We do have capability to do latter phase and trials and have some global footprint, but predominantly our region is Australia and New Zealand. What we have really seen since the COVID pandemic has been a real need to be able to pivot and adapt really quickly to the lockdown situation across Australia, and have an offering for clients in terms of having an electronic solution where not being able to go to site. Sandra has already alluded to the fact that Australia has been largely protected by COVID. We've been very fortunate, and perhaps because we're an island nation and maybe because our government acted very quickly. So we haven't had some of the issues that we've seen across other parts of the globe with, significant halts or delays in trials or trials not going ahead to the same extent in other parts of the world. And our healthcare system hasn't been impacted as in other regions of the world. So whilst COVID has driven us to having to adapt very quickly and bring on board mechanisms to go electronic and have digital technologies, it's been an interesting experience in terms of what that uptake has been like. And I think we'll talk about that more through the discussion that we're going to have today. But we certainly have seen the use of electronic technologies in the clinical trial space has been around for a very, very long time, but it hasn't been utilised to its fullest in my view. And I think what COVID has done, it's actually triggered everybody to take what's already been out there, and it's escalated its utilisation and awareness of the ability to be able to do things more remotely. I'll stop there for now and let Sandrein, my colleague, introduce herself.
Hi everyone, I'm Sandra Louwaars, Director of Business Development at Avance Clinical. I've got a background in data management, so I used to manage all the EDC systems, and we now also have capabilities for eSource and eConsent and all the eClinical suite. So it's been, as Yvonne said, an interesting era, and I think it's only moving forward from here.
Thank you, Sandrine. Thank you, Yvonne. Chris, if we could go to you now, and you can introduce yourself to everybody and let us know about the current landscape where you are.
Sure. Thank you so much. So my name is Chris Lorne. I am a strategy lead with the Cell and Gene Therapy Center of Excellence at IQVIA. We are a large CRO throughout the world, a contract research organization. And certainly it's heartening to hear some of the stories from Australia and other parts of the world. The United States has not been as fortunate in regards to what has happened with the pandemic. And so I do think before the SARS-CoV-2 virus really took hold of the planet, we were beginning to see more in the way of virtual clinical trials and remote health. And certainly the pandemic has hastened that. So from where we sit, it has been an extremely tough year, both domestically as well as in regards to cell and gene therapy trials. I think a little over 90% of cell and gene trials have been impacted in some significant way in regards to the global pandemic. And I think one of the things that we are seeing by our sponsors is a ready adoption of opportunities to do things in a more digital or remote way. So very glad to be here today, and thank you for having me.
Thank you, Chris. So I think that's everybody on the panel that's introduced now. So maybe we can look at the first question. So do clinical trials mean democratization of drug development? So who'd like to go first on answering this question?
I certainly think it's a good opportunity to do that. I think anyone who has been watching some of the things in the United States recently with imperatives for social justice, and I think Pfizer just had, or maybe one of the large pharmaceutical companies developing COVID vaccines had really wanted to make sure that there was a more equitable distribution of enrollment, with the patients that they were taking on. So I do think there's clearly that need. We know that for the most part, only 3 to 8% of the eligible patient population will enroll in a clinical trial, and that is by far predominant with Caucasian affluent subjects that can do that. So I am hoping that with recent term events, as well as initiatives to be more inclusive for the totality of patients that we will be treating with these next generation of drugs, that this democratization will take a greater effect and impetus with some of our drug development programs.
I think I'll add, I agree with Chris with what he said, and I probably would add that I think the COVID era has probably, with some of the health technology, so we've seen telemedicine come into effect. In Australia, we've certainly seen electronic prescriptions and the ability for patients to actually have access to their physicians. This is outside of the clinical trial space, but it blends across. There's certainly been an ability for patients to be better connected, and it doesn't matter where they are, in the country, so they don't have to be sitting next to the clinic in the city, but they can be, out on a farm in a rural area, but they're getting the access or more ready access to healthcare. And I think that that's going to translate into the clinical trial setting as well. And I think also what we've seen because of that, I think that we're getting more input from patients in terms of patient advocacy groups into what's happening. There's a greater awareness now, I think globally, of what a clinical trial is. I mean, I think once upon a time, a large proportion of any population in any part of the world wouldn't have a clue that, what the clinical trial or drug development process is. Whereas everybody now has a concept of what a clinical trial is and are certainly more open to being involved. So I think we are seeing some of those changes. Do we think that clinical trials mean a democratization of drug development? I'm not sure. I actually think that drug development still drives clinical activity, but that's probably a different discussion.
Yeah. Can I just add quickly? I've just heard that the federal government in Australia has put out a significant grant. So we are looking in South Australia at quite a funding to bring clinical trials further into regional and remote areas in South Australia. And this is happening all across Australia. So I think the whole telehealth and even the medical devices that come into that to measure things, the pharmacy being able to receive scripts and the medication anywhere where you are, will definitely drive this forward. So I think at least it's an enablement there. What kind of drugs the companies will develop, I guess, is before that. So that would take a while to adjust, I would think.
Kathleen, did you have anything that you wanted to add?
No, I think they covered it. Thank you, though.
Thank you. And this is certainly a topic in the UK that we've been discussing on the regulatory space. We had a whole session on it for discussing it with TOPRA, and how important it is to get communities to understand that it's not, something that's a bad thing, and how we would actually get those communities to engage. So from a UK perspective, it's certainly something that's out there as well. Okay, so the next question that we have, is patient enrolment getting more difficult in some geographies, and does a move towards virtual help? So who'd like to?
I'm happy to kick that off. And I think it does flow on from the last question. Look, I think definitely patient enrolment can be more difficult, and depending on, you know, what therapeutic area you're looking at. And, you know, I mean, I'm going to focus on oncology. Oncology has been the flavour of the decade, and there's increasing demand on patients with different sort of malignancies, and it becomes increasingly difficult to access those patients. So what I think we've seen this year is that ability to access patients, not just within, you know, the cities, but more remotely, and look at mechanisms for access to those patients. So that connection, virtual connection to, you know, screening activities. I mean, obviously there's nothing like that human interaction, and there's nothing that is going to replace the human element of a physician doing an assessment on a patient. But a lot of the activities that can be done in the screening process, for example, can sort of be narrowed down, and some of that can be done remotely. So that's allowing some access, as we've already discussed, for patients coming in from rural areas. So I do think that prior to COVID-19, the answer would have been yes to that question. I think the answer to the question is still yes. Patient enrolment is becoming more difficult. And, you know, increasingly sponsors are looking for regions where there are patient populations that are naive and that are more easily accessible. But I think the virtual trial world now has certainly opened up some avenues to be able to capture patient pools that we haven't had access to previously.
Yeah, I completely agree with those sentiments. You know, in the oncology space with CAR T, there is such competition now that if you go to any of the flagship academic centers within maybe the top 30 countries, let's say in cell and gene therapy, it's very hard to find those patients. I think slightly different from that is that with gene therapy and gene editing, now we have this opportunity for maybe potentially curing some monogenic diseases. You know, oncology is a very different beast, but for certain types of rare disease or pediatric diseases, or certainly, you know, diseases of the central nervous system, we are now seeing a tremendous uptake of opportunities to treat those patients. The problem is that based on the inclusion-exclusion criteria or particular molecular mechanisms such as HLA restriction, there can be a real challenge to finding those patients simply based on their genetic identity. And so one of the things that we have seen is a really robust foray into, you know, the genetic screening aspects that go along with these types of trials, literally trying to local or identify local or distal patients that have been de-identified, of course, but have that, you know, molecular or genetic framework that will give them the best chance to respond to the therapy. So, you know, certainly to Yvonne's point, it is becoming more difficult. I think it will become more challenging until we get some of these mechanisms right or more linear in their application.
I think I'd add too, I agree with you, Chris, completely. And I think I would like to think that, you know, we're looking at digital technologies or electronic ways of accessing patients and reaching out to patients. I'd like to think too that, to Chris's point, that, you know, we're really, personalised medicine is, you know, definitely the way forward. And, you know, whether it's the oncology space or whether it's gene therapy space or, you know, it's any other sort of therapeutic area, I think to be able to find patients more readily by having good databases, de-identified, and you know, that's another process that needs to be worked through. I think the world needs to actually look at better ways of identifying the appropriate population. And I think by having databases with good information that can be accessed to find those patients is going to be a really important way forward. It's going to make things a lot more efficient, but also a lot more cost effective as well in terms of not screening, or not trying to enroll patients that don't meet those basic criteria.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, I think one thing we've seen, and Yvonne already said that, is that there's a lot more interest in clinical trials from everyone. So if I now tell people I work in clinical trials, there's a lot of people saying, oh, I've done that before. And I just heard from a colleague that is part of an e-trial. So very excited and very positive about it. But I do think the technologies need to grow with it, and we're probably not quite there yet, both for the databases, but also, I think if you're talking about telehealth, it's not just a phone consultation, it's having the ability to do the assessments you would otherwise do face-to-face. And I think there is still a way to go. So it'd be interesting to see, and there's a lot of initiatives happening here in Australia, and I'm very excited to see where that's going, but I think that's the way forward. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. The next question that I have here is, how are challenges around the quality control of data addressed when you're working with a decentralized system? So Yvonne, did you want to take that one?
I can kick it off, yeah. Look, I think we've not seen ever the speed of, and I'm going to go with the COVID trials, whether they're treatment trials or whether they're vaccine trials. We've seen an enormous increase in the speed of being able to get data, and obviously there's huge global need, and and everything's been focused on that. And so we've seen dramatic changes that I don't think any of us in the clinical research industry would have expected to see without an impetus like COVID, in terms of moving things really quickly. But I think there is a big question mark about are we cutting corners? Are things happening too quickly, and are the quality standards being maintained? And we certainly hope that they are. But I think in terms of moving forward and in a virtual type setting with e-technologies, I do think that there needs to be still a greater education and training in terms of the use of those systems, both at the CROs and the companies supporting these technologies. I think they're probably well versed, but I think it's at the site level that there needs to be a lot more education and training about what that process is and what that means. I think there are still questions and challenges that need to be asked and answered in regards to privacy and the access of some of the data that's coming through, and the protection of that data, because it's so much easier to transfer data electronically without that de-identification. And I think some of those things are still unknowns. The other thing that I think we're seeing is that without that human element of source data verification at the site, I think that there will be questions moving forward. I think it's going to be a hybrid model. I can't see everything becoming electronic and completely remote in terms of the monitoring or the oversight of clinical trials. And now I'm speaking from a CRO perspective. And I don't think that's going to be driven by the CROs. I think they'll be driven by the regulators. I think that they're going to still expect to see a certain degree of diligence in terms of having that touch point. And so we've all learned to live with remote audits through this year, and increasingly, that's been a change as well. You might have an auditor come and audit the activity in a CRO, and they would be here for 2 days. And now we're engaging in remote audits, and there's an easy transfer because we've got the technology of data backwards and forwards. But the 2-day on site or in your facility audit is turning into a 6-day remote audit, and that has its challenges as well. So I would put it out there to say that I think that there would be a lot more interim and maybe audit activities when we've got a full sort of virtual type system, just having checkpoints in place to make, in terms of quality. And I think, you've got to ask the question about the reason why we are so diligent and have monitoring processes, and we have project oversight, and we have CROs, is to make sure that we have adherence to protocol, that the data integrity is really solid. And I think, and Sandrine can talk to this in terms of the quality of the data from a remote system, but also we want to make sure that there's no fraudulent type activity, and, you know, God forbid that there is. But I think at some point, you need to actually still have a really close touch point. So I think that you're never going to get away with a completely virtual system, in my view. Sandra, do you want to talk about the quality of the data and when it's remote? Or do you have a comment on that?
Yeah, and there's a lot of database systems out there and e-clinical systems out there that are all compliant with the regulator. It's all very strict and a lot of regulations. So I think that the overall quality is good. The data is available quite quickly, if not in real time, which allows for monitoring on an ongoing basis, and we can pick up any issues quite early on as well. So I agree it's going to be a hybrid model where we still will monitor at the sites, and there will be some paper documents as documentation in the background, but the data can be monitored on an ongoing basis and available to everyone, including the regulator, if you need to.
I know a lot of our sites, I would say the vast majority of our sites do not necessarily provide open access to their EMRs. And so therefore it requires you to go on site to look at their computer, which I think, you know, eventually we probably will get past that, and maybe COVID will hasten some of that. But I agree. I think in the near term, it'll be more of a hybrid solution. I think the sponsors or the CROs and the vendors are much more ready for that type of digital solution than many of the sponsors are. But I also agree the point that I think the quality of the data is still quite good. And I think, you know, if and when there have been issues, there have been a variety of different stakeholders that have looked into that very quickly to try to reconcile that, because it's just not good for the protocol, the program, the industry as a whole. So I think we're on the right journey. And I do think certain agencies like EMA and PMDA and FDA have said, we need, you know, CROs and others in this space to help us understand what the future looks like so that we can better prepare for that. You know, one of the things that sponsors and many in the industry have been tasked with is to reduce the cost of these trials. And I think, you know, digital options, virtual, remote options, that certainly begins to pick up that narrative and move it forward in a meaningful way.
Just a quick comment. I think that's also, again, where government comes in as well. So we need that infrastructure as well, especially if we're going out into regional areas of looking how can we collect the data, how is the cybersecurity, all of those aspects as well. So that's definitely something we are looking into as well and working on.
So you've mentioned regulators. I want to jump to the regulatory question. So do you think regulators are keeping up with the changes that are being made? And is this something that's consistent around the world, or is there a lot of difference between the different regions and different countries where you're conducting the clinical trials?
You want to go first, Chris?
Chris, did you want to jump in?
Sure. So apologies, you know, I'll speak to it in a more global sense. You know, a lot of what I look at obviously on a day-to-day is cell and gene therapy. So it's through a particular lens, and, you know, obviously it's a very rapidly evolving field, and it's hard for even the subject matter experts just to keep up with, you know, the regulatory compliance and changes that go on a day-to-day basis. I do think those countries that have been early entrants into that type of advanced therapy or trialing have an advantage currently, because the agencies and the discourse is very dynamic and active. And so what I'm always struck by is how much access, at least in the United States, sponsors and CROs and even vendors have to FDA, even in these, you know, quite challenging times for the US government, to be able to have those active discussions. I do think other parts of the world where we have emerging markets will see a robust development in cell and gene therapies, as well as advanced trialing independent of cell and gene. And I think that those agencies will certainly come online fairly quickly. I think we're already beginning to see in the Middle East, in Latin America, in parts of Asia Pacific that aren't necessarily Korea, Japan, or China, a very robust intelligence developing with the agencies. And I think that's terrific. I think that benefits everyone.
And I'd agree with everything that Chris has said. And I probably would add that I think at the end of the day, the reason why we're in the business that we're in is because we want to get medicines and technologies to patients faster. And I think the regulatory agencies are all about that as well. And so the e-technologies or the virtual space, certainly, and as Sandrine alluded to, we're seeing data and getting data coming through basically, in real time. We're seeing, not having to wait, after the closeout of a monitoring visit, waiting, 4 or 6 weeks for database lock and then for data to be analysed. So everything has been accelerated, and COVID has certainly driven that as well. And so I think there's a real acceptance by the agencies, and they're looking for a way to do that. And I think really this year they haven't had much choice because, in terms of still progressing some of the activities. And so I think there will be a catch up. I think they will need to reevaluate and reassess where this is heading, because it's heading so quickly and it is in a dynamic time for everybody in the clinical trial space. But I do think that there will still, the emphasis will be on the quality of the data. And making sure that we still can maintain that. And I don't think that we're really at risk of that, provided that the right controls are in place. And I think that will be their focus. And, it would have been probably good to have someone, a regulator on the call in terms of their perspective. But I think, I think EMA, FDA, and even the TGA, are pretty strongly aligned in that. What is interesting, I think, is that, and we're predominantly in the early phase space as a CRO, as I mentioned before, phase 1, phase 2, and we are seeing adoption from the phase 1 clinics in terms of, eSource and wanting to pivot to those sort of technology. But it's very interesting that by and large, the sponsors, because I think when they come to Australia, and there has been a huge drive to coming to Australia because obviously our clinical trial activity hasn't been hindered with a nervousness by healthy volunteers or patients to be involved in trials and go to clinics, for the fear of contracting COVID, which has made us a destination of choice, in the last year for trial activity. But interestingly, as a CRO, we offer that technology. We've got our remote monitoring SOPs, and we can offer a more virtual service, and the uptake hasn't been what I would have expected. So although there's some interest, we're not getting a huge demand. And I suspect that will be different in different parts of the world. And I thought I'd just throw that out there.
Yeah, I did.
Maybe to your point, Chris, that the sponsors probably are lagging behind in terms of moving forward with the technology.
Right. Agreed. And I think, COVID, not COVID, there'll still be a journey for us all to sort of watch and see how that works. From my organization's perspective, we've seen growth in our clinical trials by orders of magnitude. Now, I don't want to be misleading. I think that baseline was fairly minimal, when we were going into 2019. And I think 2020 has been quite the accelerant for that. And I think there's a vast market to still, encounter there. But to Yvonne's point, I do think it's been a slower adoption. I think sponsors have really been on their back heels with how to deal with some of these things. And, certainly I think the development in the trial space of these solutions is going to be our biggest responsibility as a group, as a collective, as we go forward, because I don't necessarily think we're going to have another pandemic in another 2 to 5 years. I'm hopeful. But I do think the way medicine and investigational trialing goes, we will have changed permanently in many regards. And it'll be our responsibility to sort of enable that type of evolution.
And certainly, speaking outside of the clinical trial space, but in terms of the health space in Australia, we have seen COVID accelerate telemedicine and, as I said, e-prescriptions. And I was on a panel with the some of the ministers from the federal government just the other week, and that's here to stay. I mean, that is changing the way in which we treat patients in Australia, and that will not go backwards. So, you know, we're seeing, you know, general practitioner clinics having to really change the way in which they're engaging, you know, their day-to-day patients. And so that move is already, you know, well on its road now. It's been here, the technology's been around for a very long time with very minimal adoption, and this has really accelerated that. So I suspect the same thing will happen. In terms of cost of trials, I think there's some balancing that still needs to be done. I'm going to example phase 1 trials where we're doing work in phase 1 clinics. And so those clinics in Australia, by and large, are really keen for the adoption of eSource. You know, it means less transcription errors, less time. But, you know, it's about balancing the cost of them investing in a system and then having a CRO with the system. And I think there's a bit of communication and a bit of collaboration that needs to be done to make sure that we have a seamless approach to how that data flows, and we don't have duplication of activity. Now, where that cost sits, I don't think, you know, it needs to be sorted out. But at the moment, for certainly some of the activities that we've been engaged in, we've seen that there's duplication of effort by the site and also maybe by you know, the CRO that's handling, you know, the database capability, and some of those things need to be sorted out. I think in terms of where we're heading. The other thing that's been really interesting in terms of when we've looked at, you know, when we did have a lockdown period, and it was really a protective type lockdown here in Australia, and we've gone to, let's do some remote monitoring and, you know, have sites send through data, you know, in a secure mesh platform, so that a home-based CRA could look at and review that data. It was very interesting to see that the sites went, oh, you know, that's a lot more activity for us and we're going to have to charge for that. So rather than see costs go down, we saw them go up, which was interesting.
So
Yes.
I was going to say, did you want to add something, Chris, or just, yeah, you're just agreeing?
No, I think some of this will come with a bit of a surprise that costs will probably increase in the near term, but I do think longer term there will be better solutions and more cost control as we go forward.
I agree, there has to be. I agree with you, Chris.
So one question that I have here, how do you think that using this tech and this virtual monitoring of patients, do you think that this is going to improve patient compliance in trials? What kind of impact are we looking at, do you think?
Yeah, I think we do actually. Compliance as well as engagement. We are now able to connect to patients through their device. I mean, I think everybody now has a mobile phone, if not more than one. They've got iPads and everything. So we can actually send them messages and emails about their clinical trial. They can enter their data whenever it suits them. They don't have to come to a hospital or come to an appointment, which might be, you know, not that close. And so they can connect to their physician, to the nurse at the site through a video call or a phone call, and almost do the clinical trial in their own time. So we do see better compliance. They're keen to give it a go, and once they see how it works for them, they're actually enjoying it. So yes, I do see that increase in compliance and engagement.
So it could, in fact, reduce the cost for patients if they don't have to make those trips to the actual hospital, where they could have the call virtually.
Yeah, and the burden on the patient, especially when you're
Yeah.
vulnerable patient populations. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Our organization, just prior to COVID, had rolled out a fully digital solution for patients called the Patient Portal. And it is, fully intended to engage and inform the patient in ways about their participation in a specific trial, maybe the way it hadn't in the past or wasn't able to in the past. And again, it's really key for us in the regards of retention and compliance. And we do think, to your point, that because they do have digital devices and a myriad of different information flows into them, they're going to be potentially more invested in their own care, as opposed to having to maybe get in a car and drive 30, 45 minutes, 2 hours to an appointment, to see a physician fairly routinely. So again, I think a lot of it's incumbent upon us to invent and manufacture these sorts of platforms and solutions. And then I think if you have done that in any way that really resonates with a patient or their provider, then that compliance and retention will certainly be there.
I completely agree with you, Chris, and I do think it's incumbent on the industry to do that for patients. And I think, what you're getting from them, to your point, some patients have to drive an hour or 2 hours to an appointment, then they have to sit in a waiting room because, their appointment isn't on time, and then they get to see, the study coordinator or the investigator for 15 minutes. And, the assessments are done, or they're moved through from one room to another to have assessments. And it's a very sort of clinical corralling type process. Whereas when they're sitting in their own home, they're getting, they're able to access information. I think patient portals are a fantastic mechanism for patient engagement. They can log in or log out and have a look at any time they like. They can get reminders that they need to, push a button to have a blood pressure measured if they've got, that sort of a device. And I think increasingly we're having devices that actually provide them some feedback about how they're tracking and how they're doing and that they're on schedule. And it takes, as Sandrine said, some of the burden away. It allows them to be more engaged. And I think it gives them a sense of ownership in terms of the process that they're involved in. Whereas when it's basically, it's almost like going to your clinic visit. It's like trying to go to the supermarket. You pick off the shelf what you need, you stand in a queue and then you're out. There's not a lot of reward, but I think there's a good feedback loop. And I think these provide mechanisms for keeping the patient up to date and feeling as though in some instances, they actually see some of the data coming through as well. And so they can see, what's happening. So I think there's a lot more work that we can be doing there, but I think that's the way of the future for sure.
Okay, and perhaps the last question, unless there are any other things that you want to add at the end. What do you think the future of clinical development is going to look like, and what barriers are in the way? And you might like to add in there if you have any comments about what might happen in Europe when we have the new clinical trial regulation, as that's currently going through validation.
Sure, I'll lead off.
Chris, do you want to start? Yeah.
Yes, ma'am. I think the discussion today has really highlighted on a lot of the things that are likely to evolve or come in the near term. I think remote and virtual hybrid solutions or full solutions are on the horizon. I think patient centricity will continue to be very key to agencies, and certainly the quality of the data. Sandrine had touched on that, and the importance of the rapidity in which data comes in is going to be quite key. For me, the greatest issue is going to be cost. Cost maybe with a near second being just the legal ramifications that come either with patient protections or with just the way stakeholders engage one another in terms of confidential data, information, so on and so forth, such as my CRAs going into a hospital and being able to see an EMR or not, from a remote perspective. So I think, to me, those are really on the horizon types of challenges in terms of evolution and cost, but hopeful that we can get there.
Yeah, I probably would add, I think we're going to see differences in different phases of clinical research. So I am expecting that we'll see greater changes in terms of the utilisation of, the virtual technologies in the latter phases, with access to patients. But in phase 1, with a new chemical entity at the phase safety tolerability type trials, which are a lot more intense and there's a lot more overview. I think that there will be, certainly I do think there's going to be an adoption of being able to get data faster and, we'll see some e-technologies there. But I think the phase 1 study paradigm of needing to be at site and having a bit more of a closer scrutiny will probably not change as much as the latter phase activities. And, and that will be, remains to be seen. So I think that there will be differences in different phases of the trials. I certainly agree with you that I think one of the biggest barriers or challenges will be cost, and that investment in the technologies and the resources that are needed for the change, and for some consistency. I mean, it's not going to be very helpful if a CRO has one platform and you've got 50 sites and each of the sites has another platform and you're trying to integrate all of the data coming in. I know, there's ways of doing that, but I think that still needs to be worked out. And I think we're going to see a lot more investment now in being able to have platforms where patients can actually, assessments from patients can be made in their home setting, whether it's via a phone app or a portal or a download or whatever it is. And I think, those things are going to be the challenges of having those controls in place in terms of the collection of that data. Sandrine, did you want to add anything?
No, I think the industry has been very creative over the last few years in terms of new platforms and new ideas of data capture, but it's about the implementation and adoption cost, but also, as you mentioned, the legal adoption and dealing with privacy and the regulations around the world. So, yeah, we're certainly on the road and the road forward, and we'll see where it ends.
I mean, we haven't talked a lot about e-consent, but I think, e-consent is really, I think it's a marvelous platform, but it's not really taking a paper consent form and turning into an electronic form. It's about a different way of informing and engaging with a patient. And so I think there's still a lot of work that can be done in that area.
I think I just add a couple of points. I think what I pick up a lot is the sort of infrastructure we need behind. So if we're talking about database systems and paper accessing or entering data on their phone or their devices, we need to make sure that everybody has access to that. Everybody's got access to the internet where they are. The data is secure. So there's a lot about that I think needs to happen from, I guess, more the federal point of view as well. And I think I still see a lot of potential. I mean, I've been very impressed with what's been happening around the world in the adoption, and it really hasn't halted a lot. People got up and running and started different things, and we've seen a lot of that happening in South Australia, I think. And there's also, I believe, a big chance for lots of new technologies as well. Again, with the telehealth and with the assessment of the patients on what can be incorporated. So I actually think we've got a lot of chance here to change, and I see a lot of the focus is actually on the patient, making it easier for them as well, more convenient, easier, more engaged, having access to more data, which makes them aware of what role they actually play in the trial, that they're actually pivotal in being in the trial, which I think otherwise you just probably feel a little bit like a number 1,000 in a trial. But I think it really brings it back to the patient that they are important, and their little role they play is critical in the trial.
Yeah, I think that lends itself to better recruitment for trials. And I do think that there will be a global expectation for data to be faster in trials, and not just to the sponsors, for the sponsors to get data much more quickly, but the regulator to get data more quickly as well. And I think all of this is certainly driving in that right direction. So it's I think it's exciting times for the industry ahead, but I think there's big change coming.
Certainly. I think, yeah, with transparency of data as well, how that all has to be handled from a regulatory perspective once it's actually been collected, and then when that's made available to patients so that they can see the results of any studies that they were in. I think that this is also a sea change in the way that patients are not just recruited into trials, but also that they can see the data afterwards from everybody else who participated. But then that has to be anonymized, which is another technical, perhaps a headache. But if we look at automation, it might be something that moves forward and becomes more of a reality in a shorter space of time. Okay, well, I'd like to thank all of the panelists this morning, wherever we are in the world, for joining today and for giving us these insights into what virtual trials have been like around the world. And I think that where there have been many bad things about a pandemic, one of the good things is that it has forced us to look at all these issues and has maybe accelerated some of these moves towards working in a more virtual way, which is perhaps better for patients and which may help to address some of the issues that we currently have with clinical research. So I think I'm now handing back to you, Tony.
Thanks, Dianne, and I get a nice job of popping back up onto this virtual platform to say thank you for all the insights you shared, which for our network and our audience for Genesis, I think have just planted those seeds of thought to go away on what should we be considering going forward and what the challenges are. And I think it touched upon towards the end how much the patient is a major stakeholder in this, obviously, but what breeds real collaboration is trust. And I think that sense of ownership and really being part of a project is something I feel is quite exciting about the whole electronic engagement around the potential. So thank you thanks to Sandra and Kathleen for helping bring this together from different parts of the globe. And I hope to see many of you during the Genesis conference at some point. But for now, thank you very much.
Thank you.